You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the case now hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do.
Permission to inquire, Your Honor.
Whenever you're ready, Mr. Williams.
Good afternoon. Could you introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Sarah Geering.
And where do you work, ma'am?
I work at the Sedgwick County Regional Forensic Science Center.
What do you do at the Regional Forensic Science Center?
I'm a forensic scientist in the DNA lab.
What does it take to become a forensic scientist?
The job requirements are to have a bachelor's degree in a natural science such as biology or chemistry.
Do you hold such a degree?
I do.
Do you have any other degrees?
I do. I also have a master's degree from the University of Florida.
What subject matter?
It actually is in the College of Pharmacy. However, I'm not a pharmacist. It is with an emphasis in forensic DNA and serology.
Serology, what does that mean?
Serology is usually the term that is used for identifying body fluids, such as looking for saliva or semen or blood.
How long have you worked at the Regional Forensic Science Center?
I started in September of 2003, or 2002, 2002.
So about 16 years.
Yes,
In that time, where have you been assigned?
always into the DNA lab.
How many other forensic scientists work with you in the DNA lab?
We currently have a staff of 5 full-time forensic scientists.
Now, is that process collaborative or do you work by yourself?
Most often I work by myself.
Are your results peer-reviewed, though?
Absolutely.
What does peer-reviewed mean to you?
So every case in our facility goes through a 2-tiered review system. The first review we consider a technical review, and basically another qualified analyst reviews all of my work to be sure that I'm following all of the procedures and policies that we have in place in the laboratory. Then a second review is considered an administrative review, which looks for things such as case numbers being correct, typographical errors. However, in our laboratory, this review is also carried out by another qualified forensic scientist, so it's almost as if you're getting two technical reviews, basically.
Now, some of the members of the jury may have seen crime television shows like CSI. Is your job as glamorous as it is on TV?
I don't think so.
Do you get DNA results in like 15 minutes?
No, it takes much longer than that.
So TV is nothing like real life,
That would be true.
and things don't go to script.
No.
But as part of being in a laboratory environment, does your lab have to maintain certain accreditation?
We are an accredited laboratory.
And what does that mean?
So a laboratory will voluntarily submit to be accredited. And basically, there's a national accrediting body that reviews all of the policies and procedures for our laboratory and our facility to be sure that we're following the national standards and that we're following our own policies, basically. So we are an accredited laboratory, and we are periodically audited and reviewed, and case files are reviewed, and all these things. So,
What is the accrediting body?
currently, it is the American Association of Crime Laboratory Directors that has actually been taken over by another accrediting body which is called ANAB.
ANAB, what was it before?
ASCLD Lab.
So really common terms.
Correct.
Now, as part of that accreditation process, are you involved with maintaining accreditation?
Yes, I am.
Are you individually accredited as a DNA scientist?
No, I'm not.
But do you have to go through training or periodic reviews of your work?
Yes, I do.
How does that occur?
So when everyone is hired, regardless of the amount of experience that they have from another laboratory, for example, I worked previously at the New York State Police in Albany, New York, and had a significant amount of training under my belt there. When I came to Sedgwick County, I had to undergo training through their protocols with their procedures to be online doing cases under their their rules and regulations, basically. So every single analyst that we hire has to go through this regardless of the amount of education and experience that they have. Then on top of that, we have to maintain 8 hours of continuing education every year in scientific topics and professional conferences, basically. And then we are also proficiency tested twice a year, where we are administered a proficiency test which basically has samples in it that we do not know the results for, and we then test it with all of our methods, and then we submit it to the provider, and they grade it and tell us whether or not we got the same results.
So as part and parcel to doing all of that, you have to take your time and be careful with what you do. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Part of what you do as a forensic scientist is avoiding cross-contamination.
Yes.
So what steps does a forensic scientist like yourself take to avoid cross-contamination? And if you could define that term for the jury, I'd appreciate it.
So there are different types of contamination that can occur in the laboratory. There would be cross-contamination, which Mr. Roach has referred to, would be contaminating sample to sample within the laboratory. And we have various methods in place to prevent this. For example, I only handle one piece of evidence at a time. I always decontaminate my workspace with a cleaning solution before and after each piece of evidence. I also wear personal protective gear, so I wear a mask and a coat and gloves, and then I change my PPE whenever I need to, and frequently, especially the gloves in between each exhibit.
So for DNA, have you ever testified as an expert here in Sedgwick County?
Yes, I have.
Any ballpark on how many times you've testified as an expert?
I believe it's about 45, maybe 42. I forgot to look for today.
To your knowledge, have you ever failed to qualify as an expert?
I have not, never qualified.
Judge, at this time I would tender Ms. Geering as an expert in the field of DNA analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Smart. Please articulate your views to the board's honor on qualifications.
We accept our expertise.
I'll accept Ms. Geering as an expert on DNA.
Now, this jury may or may not be familiar with DNA. It's not an uncommon science anymore. But can you briefly explain to them the term DNA and what it really means?
So the term DNA is short for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it really is the building blocks of what makes each of us humans and individual. And you inherit that DNA from your mother and your father. And so, the sperm meets the egg, and then that gives rise to the first cell of that person. And then as that embryo develops, that DNA profile is the same for all the cells in that person's body. So, for example, the DNA that you take from my mouth will match the DNA from the blood that is in my veins or on the surface of my skin, those kinds of things.
When someone is looking to find sources of DNA, what are the common sources that a forensic scientist would look for as a potential source of DNA?
We are most common asked to look for blood and semen and saliva. We also get a lot of things like cigarette butts, drinking cups, straws, articles of clothing that can have been worn by someone or may contain body fluids. We also look at a fair amount of touch items such as maybe a weapon or something that was used to pry open something, or potentially maybe steering wheel swabs or various kinds of touch items like that.
So when you get an item into the lab and you've been requested to test it to see whether there's DNA present, based on all your experience, you just look at it, you can see there's DNA, right?
No.
Why not?
So if there's a body fluid present, then yes, I have an indication that there would be cells that are present there from that body fluid. But cells are only visible microscopically, so I can't see how many cells are present in that stain. I just have experience with how much of a blood stain that I know that I need to get a good result in the laboratory. For touch type samples, a lot of times there is no staining whatsoever to be seen. It simply is that I'm swabbing the item, the surface of the item, and that I basically have sterile Q-tips that I use, and then sometimes they get dirty looking based on if there's other dirt or oils or something like that on the item, but otherwise they just look like standard Q-tip swabs.
There was previous testimony about taking of known standards via buccal swabs. Is that kind of what you're talking about? Or as a Q-tip swab?
That's correct. So when the detectives or investigators collect an oral standard from someone, they're using, I think they're about 6 inches long, a sterile type Q-tip swab that's just got cotton at one end, and they're swabbing the inside of the individual's mouth to get DNA off of the inside of their cheek.
But you said you can't really see, I mean, you can see something as blood and you should anticipate that you should get some DNA back via testing. But have you tested items for sources of DNA and had no results?
Yes.
So it's not visible to the eye. It's something that only on a microscopic level would you be able to detect once you're in the process of testing.
That's correct, like a molecular level.
Can you walk the jury through the process of obtaining a DNA sample from, say, a buccal swab or a known standard?
So we do various steps to get the DNA off of the swab head that it was collected onto. And so we do a DNA extraction, which is basically where we use a solution, a liquid solution that has all the things that we need to basically break open the cell and get all of the DNA out into solution, and then we clean that up because we want to get rid of all the proteins and the fats and the cellular membranes and things like that. We want just the naked DNA in solution. So we digest it and break the cell open, and then we clean away all the extra stuff that is not the DNA, and then we concentrate that down into a small volume. That's how we get DNA off of a sample.
You talked about breaking apart cells, but are you altering the DNA by doing that?
No.
Why not?
The DNA is a double-stranded helix that looks like a step ladder. I think everybody may have seen something like that in science class or something like that. It's a very stable structure. So when we're getting it into solution, we're treating it with a buffer that can open up the cell membrane but not destroy the DNA structure itself.
So you're trying to extract as many, I don't know the right word, but instances of DNA as you can from the cells you've collected.
That's correct.
If a material has more DNA present than less DNA present, how does that impact your results?
So once we get that DNA down into that solution, we have a step where we kind of estimate how much DNA is in it. We want to get a quantity of the DNA present. Because the reactions that we use to make copies of the specific areas of the DNA that we're looking at is sensitive to being overloaded or underloaded, excuse me. So if we add too much DNA, it will saturate the results and not be pleasant. And if we don't put enough in, then we won't get optimized results. So we have a step where we see how much is in the sample, and then we sort of have an idea of maybe the type of profile that we might get, and if there's enough DNA in the sample to do the testing.
So part of that is part of the steps of the analysis that you're going towards to determine if you can have a profile.
Yes.
And when I say profile, what does that mean?
So you're talking about then at the final result, which is we take this clean, purified DNA and we then make copies of specific areas on it. We're not making copies of the whole genome. We're taking copies of just certain locations of it. We then run it through a genetic analyzer, which then gets basically a graphical representation of the DNA profile present. Then we analyze it, determine if it's comparable, if it has a major contributor, if it's a mixture, if it's a single source profile, and then we'll do that analysis and then we'll compare it. So when you're talking about the DNA profile is sort of the final product of all the steps in the DNA lab.
So let's take a step back. You used some terms there that might be important here. You said single source. What does that mean?
A single source profile would be that there is no indication of more than one person present. Earlier we talked just briefly about inheriting DNA, that you inherit some of your DNA from your mom and some from your dad. And at each location that we're looking for the DNA, you can get one copy from your mother and one copy of your father. So you have two options for what we can expect at that DNA profile. If I see only 2 things there, then I think that that's a pretty good indication that I have just a single person at play. If I see 3 or 4 markers there, then I start to have indications that I might have more than one person at play. So a single source profile is something that is across the board, looks to be from a single individual, and that it is not a mixed sample.
So in the instance of talking about a known standard, is that typically result in a single source profile?
Yes.
So in a situation where a police officer collects a sample of material they believe is biological material at a crime scene, and they submit it to you, you could get what you've described as a mixture.
It is possible.
Can you describe what that means to the jury?
So when we have a sample that we believe is a mixture, we will see an indication of more than one individual there. So since we talked about that you can have 1 copy from your mom and 1 copy from your dad, if I see 3 or 4 markers at those areas, I can think I have 2 from this person and 2 from this person. If I get another one in there where I have 5 peaks, then I start to have an indication of a 3rd person at play. So we can sort of tell some things about the sample based on the number of genetic markers that we're seeing at each location on the DNA.
You also talked about major contributor and minor contributor. You've also talked about peaks and valleys. Can you explain what you mean in that context of peaks and valleys to explain major contributor and minor contributor to the jury?
So based on the amount of DNA from each person in the mixture, I could see height differences between the peaks of their markers. So for example, if I take 1 part my DNA to 1 part of one of your DNAs, I would expect that our peaks might be pretty equal. If I look at across the board, they're looking very equal, I can say that it's probably an equal mixture of 2 people. If I take 5 parts of your DNA to 1 part my DNA, your peaks start to be taller than my peaks. And we start to see a difference between a major contributor being apparent and a minor contributor being apparent. So if we say 10 parts to 1, then we see even more intense peaks from this contributor to this contributor. By the time we get to like 15 parts to 1 or 20 parts to 1, I will no longer detect the minor contributor in that ratio. It starts to go away and be not visible with our chemistry.
So based on that chemistry, do you have a baseline at which you're able to report a result?
Do you mean of a mixture or what?
Of a profile, to say whether a profile is even present on a source material.
We do. There are detection thresholds for our genetic system that we use, that the peaks have to go above a certain threshold to be able to be counted, basically.
So when you're talking about minor contributor, that has also met that minor threshold.
That's correct.
However, in situations where you have indications there might be some biological material below that threshold, what would you call that information?
So things below threshold, we cannot really interpret those things below threshold. What happens in mixtures is sometimes you'll have a robust profile where you have a major contributor and a minor contributor present across the board at all the markers. However, sometimes in a sample that might be degraded, which means I'm not getting results at all the markers that we look at because the DNA is maybe damaged from sunlight or heat or bacteria, I may start to see that minor person fall away. And so what ends up happening is I might have a really nice major contributor present, but my minor contributor is just not enough to be able to do anything with, if that makes sense.
Because part of what you're looking for is to compare oftentimes one known standard to an unknown. Is that fair?
The final goal is to be able to compare anyone of interest to the crime scene profile.
So you can either exclude them or not exclude them.
Correct.
So when something is of such a degraded or not robust, I think was the word you used, profile, do you make a determination on whether that is still comparable?
We do. We will say, if something is not comparable, we will say it is of no comparative value.
Pretty much, I don't know what it is, but it's it's not enough for me to render an opinion.
Right, that there is an indication of something there, but there's not enough information to be compared to anyone.
I want to talk to you now about specific testing that you were asked to do in regards to a case that Detective Tennyson, who I think we've also talked about as Detective Palmer, asked you to do.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that case?
Yes, I am.
Did it have a specific case identifier, or do you know names that are associated with it which would help you reference that case?
Usually just by the case number is fine.
So I want to talk to you about an agency case, 16C 80650.
Yes,
Did you do work on that case?
I did.
As a process of that, did you obtain materials of unknown biological material?
I did.
Did you also obtain DNA swabs or buccal swabs of known standards of specific individuals?
Yes, I did.
I'm going to name off some individuals and let me know if you received a known standard from that individual.
Okay.
An individual by the name of Manuel Gonzalez.
Yes, I had a known standard for him.
Was that of blood, semen, saliva? What was it known standard derived from?
It was an oral standard.
An oral standard would mean saliva from your mouth?
Right, the inside of the cheek swabs.
I guess it could be also cells from the inside of your cheek, right?
Yes.
An individual by the name of Guadalupe Noguera.
Yes, there was oral standards.
Ian Abarca.
Yes, oral standards as well.
Israel Abarca.
Yes, oral standards.
Laura Abarca.
Yes, a dried blood standard collected from the autopsy.
Who provided that sample to your lab?
That actually, I generated the request from that for the pathology division to submit it to the evidence clerk so that I can obtain that.
So I apologize.
Go ahead.
If a doctor is doing the autopsy, he knows to give you this sample. So would you note the doctor in your report?
I do.
Which doctor was involved in that autopsy?
It was Dr. Kipper.
Now, I have an additional name to give you, Sofia Gonzalez. Is that a name that came up in your evaluation?
Yes, I did knowns from Sofia Gonzalez.
What were the sources of her biological material?
There was 2 submissions of knowns for Sofia Gonzalez. The original was a blood tube from her birth at the hospital, and then a later submission of an oral standard from her.
Do you know who submitted the sample from the hospital to your lab?
I believe, let me check my notes really quick.
If the first page of your report would refresh your recollection.
Is there? I think it was Sergeant Elmore. Yeah, Sergeant Brad Elmore submitted it.
So Sergeant Elmore gives you blood from the hospital when Sophia was born.
Yes.
You tested that type of material before.
Yes.
Do you know how it's obtained?
From the lab, from the hospital?
When a child is born, is it a standard practice to take blood?
It was a small blood tube, I would assume, drawn for some sort of testing, for medical testing at the laboratory. It was like a pediatric size, I think it was a heparin anticoagulant tube.
So that contains blood, and you said blood has the potential to give you a DNA profile.
Yes.
You said there were 2 sources, though. What was the other?
The additional swabs submitted were an oral standard from Sofia Gonzalez.
And do you know who submitted that one? Was it
Detective Tennyson.
So Tennyson has given you Sophia's inside of her mouth,
Yes.
and you've also got blood from her birth.
Yes.
Or at least, when it comes to the lab, it's identified as being from a source and a name, right? You don't know if it's the same person.
Correct.
Do you compare those? Do you get independent DNA profiles of those 2 profiles from blood of Sofia Gonzalez and the oral standard of Sofia Gonzalez?
Yes,
Were they the same?
they were.
So how would you explain that to jury? Is there a way that you identify that as being from the same source?
We do. So the way that our reports are worded is that the dried blood standard, because Keep in mind the sample that was submitted to the laboratory was a liquid, so I took some of it out, I dried it, and then I used that dried sample to go forward for DNA. So the sample from the dried blood of Sofia Gonzalez and then the oral standard of Sofia Gonzalez cannot be excluded as having originated from a common source, meaning these are two known samples from what we believe is the same individual, and they can't be excluded as being the same profile, basically.
So when you look at them, you're not going, I've got two different people here.
No, they are consistent with one another.
So now you know the child that is, that Detective Tennyson has interaction with matches the sample taken at the birth at the hospital.
Correct.
Taken on different days.
Yes.
Did you also receive a known standard in the name of Yesenia Sesmas?
I did.
What kind of sample was that? Was it blood or otherwise?
It was an oral standard as well.
Was that submitted to you by Detective Tennyson?
Yes.
Were you able to compare were you able to obtain a profile from that buccal swab?
I did.
Were you able to compare that to determine whether that person was related to Sofia Gonzalez?
So we basically can do a maternity or a paternity. We don't have the calculations to do further types of kinship studies. So the types that we can do is strictly like maternity and paternity. So that was the exam that I did, and that Yesenia Sesmas is excluded as the biological mother of Sofia Gonzalez.
What does that mean when you say excluded?
So it means that she cannot be the mother of Sofia Gonzalez. When we've talked about the inheriting the one copy of DNA from your mom and one copy from your dad. So we look at the profile of the child and we look at the profile of the person in question, and we should expect that they share a marker at each location on the DNA.
So if you were to test my DNA and that of my mother, you would get what type of relation? Would it be 100% match, 75% match? I mean, how would those relate for you in comparing?
Under most normal circumstances, we would expect there to be a match at every genetic location. There are sometimes genetic mutations that can happen in that inheritance process. We allow for that with some mathematical calculations. So we would expect that there might be one or two mutational events, but most of the time what we see in the laboratory is we see matching of at every location.
Now, you have a buccal standard from Manuel Gonzalez.
Yes.
Did you obtain a profile that was of comparative value?
Yes, I did.
Did you compare that with, I guess it would be paternity of Sofia Gonzalez?
Yes, I did.
Did you obtain a result?
Yes.
What is your result?
That Manuel Gonzalez cannot be excluded as the biological father of Sofia Gonzalez. And I should clarify, the way that this report statement is written is slightly different. It says, assuming that Laura Abarca is the biological mother of Sofia Gonzalez, Manuel Gonzalez cannot be excluded as the biological father of Sofia Gonzalez.
Why do you have to make the assumption in order to render that opinion?
In this case, we wanted to be sure that we had a known standard from the child because we didn't know what type of comparison we were going to be making later down the road. So we worked on the assumption that Laura Abarca, the deceased person, is the biological parent to the tube that was labeled baby girl Abarca, and then make that comparison to Manuel Gonzalez. It actually makes for a slightly more stringent statistical calculation.
Is that because, as you've described, you should get specific markers for the mother and specific markers for the father on a child?
That's correct.
And those, because they're from two individually different people, should also not be the same marker locations on those profiles?
Correct. They would not be exactly the same. They would share just usually a single marker at each location.
So one marker for a father, one marker for a mother.
That's correct.
And in this case, were you able to extrapolate a statistic probability of Manuel Gonzalez's parentage of Sofia?
Yes. So the probability of paternity is approximately 99.9%. The DNA results obtained are approximately 25 million times more likely if Manuel Gonzalez is the biological father of Sofia Gonzalez than would be the case if an unrelated random individual was the father.
Why don't you get 100%?
It will never be 100%. We use the genetic frequencies in a mathematical calculation to give the probability of paternity, basically. So a number like 25 million would be more discriminating, basically, than if I said it was only 800 times more likely that that individual would be the father versus an unrelated individual.
Let's talk about some other specific items that were submitted for testing. Did you receive a swab from a shell casing?
I did.
Were you able to obtain a DNA profile of any biological material from that shell casing?
No DNA profile was detected from the cartridge casing.
Is that unusual?
No.
Why?
There's various reasons for that. There has been some research into obtaining DNA profiles from cartridge casings, but we're talking about a very small surface area usually, and then it's a surface area that may not have been handled for very long, as well as that there is a very hot reaction that takes place when a firearm is discharged. That gunpowder ignites and explodes and can actually damage the DNA if there is any DNA left on that surface. So I was not surprised that there was no profile detected.
So you have a small area to put touch DNA, right? Unless
Correct.
there's blood, it's just you're saying touch DNA, which would be cells sloughed off from the skin?
Yes.
And that you talked about areas where DNA is capable of being destroyed or degraded. And you're saying heat is one of those?
Yes.
Let's talk about swabs from doorknobs. Did you receive any doorknob or lock swabs from the scene at 215 North Brunswick?
I'm not sure I know the exact address, but I did receive swabs from a front door knob and lock, and then also, that was the interior front south doorknob and lock and the exterior front south doorknob.
So these would have been swabs collected in Detective Tennyson's investigation.
Yes.
So while you don't know the address, she would.
Yes, and it may be, on the paperwork that it was submitted with.
It's not relevant, I think,
Okay.
for our conversation here, but based upon those areas, were you able to obtain any type of profile from either of those swabs?
The swabs from the interior front south doorknob and lock were partial in nature and determined to be of no comparative value.
So partial, if I'm understanding you right, that means you've got some DNA there, but it's just not enough for you to say it's a person. Or, I may withdraw that. You don't know what that profile means in terms of a comparative value.
Correct. So in this type of a scenario, what it means is I was detecting markers at some areas, but not enough for any type of comparison.
When you talk about thresholds, how many markers do you have to see before you can say you have a profile that's of a comparative value?
So at this time, we didn't have a firm rule of how many we have to have. I believe that this profile only had 2, which would be clearly of no comparative value for that type of chemistry.
With only 2 markers, you could have a lot of people test as a potential source of that profile then.
Yes, and let me just look at it for certain so that I'm not misspeaking. Actually, I only have markers over our detection threshold of the peaks at one area. I can see that there's another area where I do have some peaks below threshold, so really I would only have one area on the DNA that was above threshold, and that's not enough.
So if we were to look at the swabs from the exterior or south doorknob, so I'm going to guess on the outside of the house,
Yes.
were you able to obtain a profile from that area?
Yes, I did.
Can you describe what kind of result you received?
So the DNA profile from the swab's exterior front south doorknob is a mixture of at least 2 individuals. The major contributor to this profile is consistent with the profile of Manuel Gonzalez. Therefore, Manuel Gonzalez cannot be excluded as the major contributor to this profile.
So if Mr. Gonzalez is coming home and puts his hand on that door, you wouldn't be surprised to find his DNA?
That's correct.
Was he the single source of DNA for that profile, or were there other potential sources there?
There are other indications of additional, at least one other individual there, just not enough to be compared.
So again, like we were talking about in terms of peaks and valleys, you don't have enough DNA material to say, I can compare this with other known standards.
That's correct.
But when you identify a major contributor as being consistent with the profile you know, are you able to exclude anyone as being a source of that profile?
I am.
So when you say, as the major contributor, Yesenia Sesmas was not the major contributor on that door, no?
Yes, she is excluded as the major contributor to this profile.
Neither is Guadalupe Noguera,
Correct.
nor Ina Barco or Israel Barco.
Correct. They're all excluded.
So, but you don't know who that partial profile or what that partial profile means.
Correct.
Were those all of the sources of potential DNA and all the items that you were asked specifically to test?
Yes.
But you had received other items in the course of the investigation, but were not asked to test those.
Correct.
Can you describe generally what those type of items were?
So at the time when the case was submitted, they had also collected some items that the baby would have had contact with, such as a pacifier and like a headband or a baby cap, that we could try to get DNA off of those things too if the blood standard from the hospital did not work. Sometimes when a sample has other additives to it, such as heparin or EDTA or fluoride, it can cause issues with the DNA process. So I had told Sergeant Elmore to go ahead and submit those items in case the blood standard was not able to yield a profile.
When you said some science stuff there that I kind of missed. Heparin, I recognize. Is that a type of drug?
Heparin, there is a use for heparin for blood thinning properties. It's also used as an additive for some blood tubes so that the blood doesn't clot when it goes into the tubes so that the testing, like medical testing, can be done.
But those items didn't change the profile in that blood.
No.
So we still know it's Sophia's blood.
It is consistent.
And you're following your protocol, say it's consistent with the profile of Sophia Gonzalez that you obtained?
Yes.
I don't believe I have any further questions, Judge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Smart. Ms. Geering, thank you very much for serving that as beautiful witness. Counsel approved. The next few witnesses are from Texas. They are coming in from Texas tonight, not available today. So we're going to take a little early recess today. Please remember the admonition of having under remains in effect. Don't discuss the case with anybody else, or anybody else discuss the case with you. Do no independent fact finding or research concerning any issue involved in this case. And I'll again remind you for planning purposes, we will be in recess tomorrow at 4:30. Mostly because of the Burger Festival street closings, unless you want to stick around for the Burger Festival. For that, we'll be in recess. Have a safe and fun evening. We'll see you tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, 9:20. And we're trying to start the book at 9:30 as possible. Again, I have a small docket in the morning. Thank you for inviting me. I'll ask everybody to enter in the form, so we'll off the floor.